It's Danny Flexon here for Seconds Out. Delighted to be joined by veteran boxing journalist Colin Hart. Colin, how are you?
I'm excellent. Very good for an old man.
Very good for any man. We're here at Glaziers Hall in London Bridge. Frank Warren's announcing two new signings to Queensberry Promotions, one of whom is Chantel Cameron, former undisputed world champion, and the other, a son of a legend in Adam Hamid, son, of course, of Prince Nassim. What do you make of Frank's new signings?
Well, let's talk about Adam. I feel very sorry for him because he's got a hell of a job on his hands. It's very, very difficult to follow a father in any sport, particularly a brilliant one like his dad was. I mean, Naz was one of the greatest fighters, British fighters I've seen, and to go into his, into his bootstraps, if you like, is going to be hard on him. I mean, very recently I did a column with two sons of brilliant fighters. One was Joe Bugner Jr., whose father, as you know, fought Ali twice. Joe Frazier was the British, European and Commonwealth heavyweight champion. The other one was Ross Minter, whose father, Alan, was the undisputed world middleweight champion. And they told me they went through hell. People in the crowd screaming at them, "You'll never be as good as your dad," and all the rest of it. He's got all that to face, probably. So it's going to be very difficult for him.
And then you've got Chantel Cameron, kind of a marquee signing. I mean, her only defeat was the one to Katie Taylor, very, very close, and beat her in the first fight, of course. A former undisputed world champion, and Queensberry not known for female boxing necessarily. Big step forward.
Well, yes. I mean, it's going to be interesting to see. I mean, I'm sure she'd like another fight with Taylor. Whether she would get it, whether Frank could get that for her, we'll find out, because it's more than likely now, because he's now working with Eddie Hearn of Matchroom, who's got Taylor under contract. So there is a possibility we might have the trilogy.
Well, perhaps on the next 5 versus 5 event, we know the first one's coming up June the 1st, and they're talking about doing another one in September. What do you make of the whole 5 versus 5 concept, and who's the early money on?
Well, it's interesting. What I'm pleased about in this modern day and age is at last the public are getting what they've always wanted, the best versus the best. And it's come about through Saudi money, and the Saudis, although they've got millions to throw around, they want value for their money. And that's why we are getting, on paper, these great fights, which can only be good for boxing.
Looking at the 5 versus 5 matches, who do you think is going to come out on top overall, Eddie or Frank?
Well,
but no loyalty on this one.
Well, I think the Croatian is going to beat Dubois. I think he'll be too seasoned, too clever for him. And I think the Wilder we last saw, he's going to get knocked out by Zhang. But if Wilder is the Wilder that used to be fighting Tyson Fury, it might be a completely different result.
So it's looking good for Eddie then?
Well, so on paper. I mean, but surprises do happen. Only recently, 2 weeks ago, we had Ryan Garcia beating Haney. Nobody expected that, least of all me. But it just shows you there's no certainties in this world.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned that. I was wondering how to segue from Wilder to Garcia. We've obviously heard in the last few days that he's tested positive, Ryan that is, not Wilder, for Ostarine on 2 separate occasions, once the day before the fight and once on the day of the fight itself. How surprised, if at all, were you that the latest boxer has failed a drug test?
Well, I would, some years ago I would have been very surprised. But unfortunately, it does appear that a lot of fighters are getting themselves some help, which of course is highly dangerous. And I've always said, and I know certain fighters agree with me, or ex-fighters agree with me, certainly Barry McGuigan agrees, that anybody found guilty, any fighter found guilty of taking a performance-enhancing drug should be banned for life.
And that's regardless if it's knowingly or not. It's a strict liability thing.
Well, I think again, if you want loopholes, there's always a loophole, but it will certainly focus minds if they knew, if they found this substance was in their body, then they're banned, they're finished.
And given that, it certainly was in his system, regardless of what his explanation is, do you feel the result should be overturned?
Well, no, they won't do that. I mean, because otherwise You know, you could go back through history and change all kinds of results. No, the result must stand. But, you know, it's a great pity because Ryan Garcia is a tremendous talent, but he's a strange kid. There's no doubt about that. After his last performance before the Haney fight, when people thought the fight shouldn't be allowed to happen because they said they were worried about his mental state. But I wasn't of that opinion because I remember vividly Cassius Clay at the weigh-in before the first Liston fight seemed to go off his head. His blood pressure went sky high and the doctors said this boy should not be allowed to fight. He is terrified and it's affected him mentally, etc., etc. Of course, Cassius Clay was putting on an act and he spooked Liston over it. So, you know, it's been done before, so I was a bit wary about these people saying the fight shouldn't happen. But of course, he was overweight. And so, you know, the result is suspect because of it.
Let's switch tack to a fight that you're very much looking forward to this weekend. Canelo against fellow Mexican Jaime Munguia on Cinco de Mayo as well. What do you expect from this fight?
Well, you know what? You put two menacing Mexicans in the same ring, and it's like lighting the touch paper to a stick of gelignite. I expect an explosion. I'm really looking forward. You know, sometimes people like me, boxing writers who've been around a long time, get a bit blasé. I'm really looking forward to this fight. I mean, as I say, some of the when Mexicans fight Mexicans, just cast your mind back. I know it was 20 years ago, but Marco Antonio Barrera against Eric Morales, a trilogy, and they punched each other to a standstill in every fight. And there have been others. There have been when Zapata fought, people like those guys, and Chavez. Mexican fighters are so exciting. There's only one way to fight. They seem to have the blood of someone like their revolutionary hero, Emilio Zapata, running through their veins. It can't be off it, you know. There's no fancy dance stuff with them when they get in the ring. So I expect an explosion. Now, Canelo is one of the most remarkable fighters we've ever had, coming up for his 65th fight, his 25th world title fight. He's been going for nearly 20 years. He's 33, and yet he's still 6-1 on favourite. But it wouldn't surprise me if there was a surprise. I don't expect it, but it wouldn't surprise me because this boy Munguia, John Ryder fought him in his last fight, and he'll tell you he never stops throwing punches from all angles. So that's why I'm looking forward to it. It'll be Canelo's skill, expertise, and, you know, must point out that Canelo at 33 has slowed down. There's no doubt about it. And he hasn't stopped anybody for 3 years now. He's won all his last 4 fights, including the loss to Bivol, all went a distance. So maybe he's slightly in decline.
And just before I let you go, the real big one is just 2 weeks away now. Tyson Fury against Oleksandr Usyk, all being well. They enter the ring against each other out in Saudi. Who are you picking and why?
Well, I think, on paper, logically, Usyk should have no chance of beating a man 6 inches taller and probably 5 stone heavier than him. It's the old cliche, good big uns beat good little uns. But what I've seen of Tyson, certainly against Ngannou, I think he's in decline. I think maybe those 3 fights with Wilder, and that is now catching up with him. People forget that Tyson's been at it for 15 years. He's 35 now, and he's had a lot of hard fights, those Wilder fights. Recently, Chisora, and we discount those. Usyk is a very, very clever item, and I have a leaning towards him. If he can get the decision on points in Saudi, but I think he could do it.
Brilliant. Colin, always a pleasure, mate.